Of the roughly 700 men who rode into the valley of the Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876, only a fraction lived long enough to describe what actually took place there, and Major Marcus Reno was one of the very few positioned to see nearly the whole disaster unfold from beginning to end. He watched his own 3 companies get pushed back out of the valley. He watched his command dig into a barren hilltop and hold it against overwhelming numbers for the better part of 2 days. And from that hilltop, he watched smoke rise from the direction Custer and 5 more companies had ridden, long before anyone knew what it meant. Reno had already built a solid record as a soldier by 1876 through the Civil War and years of frontier service, but survival at the Little Bighorn would come to define the rest of his life in ways nothing else did. He was accused of cowardice. He was accused of drinking through the worst of the fighting. He was investigated, court-martialed, and dismissed from the Army years later on unrelated charges, and it would take until 1967 for a military board to finally set the record straight about what he had actually done on that hill. Reno told his own version of events not long after the battle in detailed first-person testimony describing exactly what he saw, heard, and decided at each stage of the fight. That account follows here, largely unchanged from how he told it.
Custer's order was simple enough: hit the village. I moved my 3 companies out, crossed the river, and pushed roughly 1.5 miles across open valley floor toward the pony herds and the lodges beyond them. Gunfire found us before we had covered half that ground. Thin at first, then steadier, coming from ahead and from both flanks. Whatever count Custer had been working from, it was wrong, and I knew it before we had gone much further. The warriors kept coming, more of them by the minute, until it was clear 3 mounted companies had no business trying to hold ground against numbers like that in the open. I put the men on foot and formed a skirmish line, carbines up, and we traded fire as best we could. It was not enough. We were giving ground faster than we could hold it. I pulled the command back toward a stretch of bluffs where we had left our horses and mules under guard earlier. The retreat was not clean, men mounted, men on foot, everyone moving at once with warriors pressing from more than one side. Once we made the high ground, I got every man down behind whatever the terrain offered, mostly sagebrush and the shape of the hill itself. And we started building a line with no time to do it properly. The real attack came around 5:30 that evening. It hit us from several directions at once, heavier than anything I had seen before that day, and it did not stop with the daylight. Rounds cut through the brush around us all evening, and the men learned fast to fire in short, aim bursts rather than waste ammunition on shapes moving in the grass. We held through the night, firing blind at muzzle flashes and the sound of movement, never quite sure how close the next rush would come from, or from which direction it would come next. Around 9, it eased. The warriors pulled back off the hill, though we could still hear them out in the dark. Fires, voices, horses moving in the valley below. We used the quiet to dig in properly, working with knives, tin plates, and canteens since there had not been time to bring anything better, scraping out low trenches through the night, and bracing for the fighting to start again before we finished. It held off until roughly 2:30 in the morning on the 26th. Then it came back hard, and this time it ran from before dawn until about 9:30, wave after wave hitting our position from the high ground around us. At the same time, they went after our horse herd from a hill just out of range of our carbines, and we lost stock through the whole stretch with no way to answer it. By 8 that morning, the weight of the attack had shifted onto Colonel Bentine's stretch of the line. It got close enough that one warrior rode almost on top of a soldier who had already fallen, trying to count coup before anyone could stop him, and he was shot down before he finished it. By then, we had more wounded than we could properly care for, and almost no water left, and something had to give. The river sat about 600 yards off, across ground the Indians had covered with fire since the fighting started. Bentine organized a party to make the run for water, with a skirmish line laying down cover while they went, men moving down the slope in short rushes with canteens and kettles in hand, while the covering fire did what it could to keep the far bank quiet. It cost us 1 man killed and 6 wounded, but they made it back, and the water went straight to the men who needed it most, many of whom had gone the better part of a day without any. Through the rest of that day, the Indians kept harassing our position, though it had a different feel to it than before, looser and less determined. I watched a large fire take hold in the valley below, throwing up a wall of dust and smoke across the whole basin, and behind it, the warriors seemed to be pulling out in an organized column, heading for the Bighorn Mountains, something like 30 miles off. For a moment, watching that, I let myself think it might be Custer, finally coming up to reach us. We had no idea yet what had actually happened to him, and the 5 companies that rode off with him. That word did not reach us until the next morning, when General Terry's column arrived. Benteen and his men went out to the field where Custer had fallen, and it was they who confirmed the worst of it and identified the officers among the dead. To understand how the command ended up on that hilltop in the first place, you have to go back further, to the order that started the whole fight. I had been given command of Companies M and G, and Custer's instruction, delivered through Colonel Cook, his regimental adjutant, was to advance rapidly and charge, with a promise that I would be supported. That was the last direct order I ever got from him. Cook rode with me a short way, and Captain Keogh came along too, telling me plainly that they were all coming with the advance, that he was coming as well. After we crossed the ford into the valley, though, I never saw either man again. Once I understood the size of the force ahead of us, I sent word back warning Custer. But I kept the charge moving, trusting the rest of the regiment was coming up behind me, the way I had been told. Closing on the village, I saw warriors working around my left flank, cutting off any way back the way we had come, and I understood then that no support was coming, that 3 companies were facing that village alone. I got the men off their horses and into a stand of timber along the river, the only cover we had. From there, I secured the horses and pushed forward again toward the village, closing to within about 200 yards before the Indians came out to meet us in numbers we could not hold against. There was only one way out of it. I gave the order to charge back through them toward the bluffs on the far side of the river, and we fought our way across. Not long after, Colonel Benteen and Captain McDougal reached us there with their companies. It turned out that in falling back the way we had stumbled onto a ford none of us had known existed, and it was that crossing that got us to the bluffs at all. Once there, I had roughly 112 men and 25 scouts left under me. I have thought many times since that if we had not made that charge when we did, my command would have ended the same way Custer's did. Looking back, our biggest mistake going into that campaign was underestimating how many warriors that village actually held, somewhere around 2,500 at minimum, possibly as many as 5,000. I have served with and against plenty of skilled cavalry over the years, and the Sioux and Cheyenne we fought that day were as good as any light cavalry I have come across. Captain Anson Mills told me he felt exactly the same, having faced many of those same warriors under Crazy Horse a week earlier at the Rosebud. As for what happened to Custer's own command, from what I have pieced together since, Lieutenant Cook fought with real courage almost to the end. He stayed mounted even after Custer himself had gone down, leading what men he had left through charge after charge against the warriors closing in. Curley, the Crow Scout, and the only man confirmed to have survived that part of the field, said the Sioux kept falling back in front of Cook's small group over and over before finally closing in and finishing them for good.
None of that hilltop fighting made it into the story most people know about the Little Bighorn. The popular version ends with Custer, alone on his own rise of ground, and it treats everyone else on that battlefield as a footnote. But roughly 350 men survived that day because Reno held his position on the bluffs instead of trying to fight his way back into the valley a second time, and by any fair reading of the numbers he was up against, that decision kept a bad defeat from becoming a total one. It did not earn him much credit at the time. He spent years afterward answering for it, accused of drinking during the fight, of losing his nerve, of failing to support Custer when it mattered. He took command of what was left of the 7th Cavalry once the scale of the disaster was known, and a formal court of inquiry in 1879 examined his conduct and cleared him of the most serious charges against him. That did not end things for him. A separate scandal in 1877 got him suspended for 2 years, and a second court-martial in 1880 found him guilty of assault and drunkenness on duty, closing out his military career for good. He died of cancer in Washington, D.C. in 1889, still trying to clear his name, and was buried in an unmarked grave. It took until 1967 for a military review board to go back through the record and change his discharge to honorable, and his remains were eventually moved to Custer National Cemetery, on the battlefield where his command made its stand. His account is still one of the clearest first-hand records of what actually happened there. If you want the rest of this story, and the ones like it that never made it into the textbooks, subscribe for what is coming next.